this would be a great session for us to sort of go into. And this is also an extension, if I can say, of all the learnings that we have had from our founder ecosystem, of having sort of been in the ecosystem for close to a decade and a half or so, and the learnings, sort of from the sort of founder ecosystem has also been quite immense. And treat these sessions, including this one, as a collation of those learnings that we wanted to share with a larger audience and people who have not been sort of part of it up until now. Right? With that, just wanted to give you a quick context on the session. I'll hand it over to Steve. Steve, please take it away.
Great, thanks so much, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining. Um, as we mentioned earlier, we have a good-sized group here. If you have questions, please ask them anytime. Of course, we'll have time for questions at the end, but this session's really for you. We want you to get the most out of it you can, and probably the best way to do that is if you ask questions along the way. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about cybersecurity. I'll be talking about M-Trend's report. Before I do that, though, maybe it makes sense for me to just quickly introduce Mandiant, in case you haven't heard of Mandiant before. Mandiant's a cybersecurity firm. We are a little bit different than the traditional firms. We don't build firewalls. We don't build antivirus. What we do is, what we're most well known for is responding to the victims of cyber attacks. And we've been doing that since 2004. We have sort of a unique view on what goes wrong in organizations and all the business fallout that can result from a successful cyber attack. Now, those cyber attacks are usually quite sensitive, and a lot of the details don't make their way to the public. Those details can be helpful to organizations. And so what we do is every year we put together this M-Trends report. It's anonymized and aggregated, so there's no individual victims that are identified, but it's a public report that everyone can learn from. They can learn what are the insights around what is Mandiant seeing with breaches, and take that information back and use it to better defend themselves against attacks which may come to them. Mandiant was acquired by Google at the end of last year, so we're coming up now to being about a year as part of the Google family. Okay, so that's a bit on Mandiant. Now, what happens when Mandiant shows up to the victim of a cyber attack? Usually there's more questions than answers. Despite having many, many layers of preventative security controls, when those preventions fail, those preventative controls are usually not very good for investigation. And so the questions that the business needs answers to, questions like, what did the attackers steal? How long have they been inside the network? How did they get in the first place? How much access does the attacker have? Do they have access to maybe some low-value desktop systems, or do they have administrator access to our servers, and can they see maybe our customer information? Even things like, well, what is this hacker trying to do? Are they trying to collect information from us? Are they trying to extort us? Are they planning to deploy ransomware? What's the motivation of the attacker? When you discover attack, those questions typically don't have answers. And so what it takes is a forensic investigation across the environment, as well as cyber threat intelligence and understanding about the different threat groups to come to the answers to those questions. And you want to get to those answers as quickly as possible. And so that is called incident response in the cybersecurity industry. Mandiant's been doing that for close to 2 decades now. And what we do is we get the answers to those urgent business questions. We get those answers very quickly about what happened and what to do about it. Without that information, it's very hard for the business to know how to respond. And when you do that, you come to know about the threat actors, how they operate, what their motivation is, what their tactics, techniques, and procedures are, how they use malware, how they're evolving in their sophistication. And all of that helps to speed up incident response as well. And again, get to those critical answers. So that's what Mandiant does. And every year, we take the aggregate learnings of all the incident response work we do, and we put it into this M-Trends report. And it's a publicly available report. It's freely available. This year is our 14th edition of, that report. And you can just Google for Mandiant M-Trends and download the PDF. So the report talks about a lot of things. It's about 100 pages long. There's a lot of really good information in it, but maybe the most interesting part is a section called By the Numbers. And this is interesting statistics that we observe. There are statistics that are directly measured by Mandiant. So this isn't coming from a survey. It's not coming from third-party sources. The statistics you're about to see are real-world statistics measured by Mandiant incident responders in active breaches around the world. And we look at things like, how long does it take to identify there's an intruder in the network? When you do identify them, how was it identified? What are threat actors targeting? How do they do it? Who are they? And how can you prepare? So I would say the most interesting statistic is something called dwell time. And dwell time is defined as the amount of time an intruder is present in a victim organization before they're discovered. Right now, a physical attack, when you're attacked, you know it. But in a digital attack, the attacks are often invisible. And an intruder can go undiscovered for many days, many weeks, sometimes months, sometimes even years before the victim realizes that they have an intruder in their network. And we call that amount of time where the intruder is operating in the network undiscovered, we call that dwell time.
Steve, a quick question here was how can an organization sort of get to this metric better? Is it usually retrospective from your past attacks or industry numbers, etc.? Or are there ways to measure this better? Because that has always been the key to sort of being more proactive next time you get attacked. So what are your thoughts, Steve, on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes let's focus on how a security operations center might measure this number, right? A security operations center, sometimes I'll see security operations centers reporting on, the number of attacks their firewall stopped, right? And you see incredibly large numbers. We stop 50,000 attacks a month. At that point, I'm not sure that the management stakeholders really have a feel for the difference. Does it matter if it's 50,000 or 70,000?
Right.
I think a better metric is this dwell time. Sometimes you'll hear it called MTTD, mean time to detection. And in order to calculate it, you need two timestamps, right? The first timestamp is the timestamp you detected the intruder. And you sort of get that for free because you know when you've detected the intrusion. The harder timestamp is when did the attacker get in? And that one requires a forensic investigation. And sometimes you might not even have certainty on when the attacker got in. Sometimes it may be just the earliest evidence of intrusion. And so you can use that for the starting point. You just subtract those two timestamps and you get a dwell time. And what you want to do is, for the intrusions that you're having, you want to track this mean time to detection. And hopefully, if your security program is evolving and getting better, what you'll see is a downward trend of the dwell time or that mean time to detection as your security capabilities improve. And that's one way to measure, am I getting better? Is my security operations center getting better at what they need to do?
Got it. Fair point.
the cousin of the mean time to detect is the mean time to respond, right? And so then once you have a detection, then you need to do a full investigation and you need to scope the incident. Is it just one machine the attacker has access to? Is it many machines? Has the attacker compromised any passwords, any administrator passwords? So what all are the things that I need to reset in terms of reimaging machines and resetting passwords before I've responded to this incident? And so the time between the mean time to detect and the response time gives you the mean time to respond. So that's another interesting statistic to measure. So let's take a look at, and thank you for the question. Please keep the questions coming. So let's take a look at dwell time, and let's look at this in the APAC region, because the numbers do differ from geography to geography. And so the number that we measured for, right now we're in 2023, so we haven't collected all the data. We're not through 2023 yet. So we look at the previous year of 2022, January to December, all of the investigations Mandiant responded to, and we calculate the mean dwell time as 33 days. That should be a pretty shocking number, right? It takes over a month for the average organization in Asia Pacific simply to realize that an intruder has gotten into their network, right? That number is way too long. And even worse than that, the number is headed in the wrong direction, because the previous year in 2021, the median dwell time was 21 days. It was shorter. And so it's getting longer, which is not good. It's also that 33 days is the highest of any geography globally. So not so good news for APAC there. We have some work to do in detecting intrusions. But on the flip side of that, if you zoom out and you look at not just 21 and 22, but let's rewind all the way back to 2017 and look at the dwell time, you'll see a very different picture. What you'll see is that in 2017, the median dwell time was 498 days, right? So just 6 years ago, the average amount of time to detect an intrusion was over a year, close to 2 years. And in that 6 years between 2017 and 2022, you see that 498 days drop to 204 days, and then 54 days, a little bump up to 76 days, but down to 21 days in 2021, and then a little bump up to 33 days in 2022. So while there is a jump in the wrong direction from 21 to 22, the overall trend for the last 6 years has been a spectacular success. Organizations are getting much, much better at detecting intrusions than they were even just 5 or 6 years ago. Any questions on that?
Yeah. Hi, Steve. My name is Chandan. I'm the CTO and co-founder at a startup called Wishlink. I have two questions here. First of all, can you elaborate a little on the internal detection versus external entities? Who are these external entities? And it seems like 2017 was a jump from 2016 as well. Like, did something happen in 2017? Like, globally, was it a insecure year? Like, what happened? Can you shed some more light on that?
Sure. The 2016 number is at the edge, right? It's at the start of the graph. So I suspect that Mandiant's presence in APJ was much smaller 7 years ago, and the data size, or the data set size of the investigations was more limited. And so I would just say that that is at the edge of the data collection, and that's probably why you see an anomaly. If you'll notice for 2016, we're not even breaking out the external versus internal the way we are in the rest of the year. So I would almost discard that 2016 number and just start looking at 2017 and beyond. And then for your second question in what's the difference between external and internal? And so that actually brings us to the next point, which is detection by source. So an internal detection is when an organization makes the discovery of the intrusion by themselves through an investment they've made, right? So maybe it is their own security operations center. Maybe it's a security technology that they've purchased that's detected the intrusion. Maybe it's a MSSP, that's a managed security service provider that they've hired to manage their security that's detected their intrusion, but something they've invested in has found the intrusion. That means that their efforts and investments are paying off. The opposite of that is an external detection. And that's where the victim organization didn't identify it themselves. Instead, it was an outside entity. And that outside entity can come in many forms. It could be a security vendor who made the observation. It could be a law enforcement organization. It could be a national CERT. It could be a third-party partner, vendor, or supplier who may have noticed unusual activity interacting with this organization. So it's something outside of the investments that the victim has made. So that's the difference between internal and external. And if you look at how often the intrusions are detected, internal versus external, you can see that about 2/3 of the time in APAC, excuse me, it's external detection versus 1/3 internal. And again, that varies across geographies. Americas is a little bit more balanced, and EMEA is almost all the way at 75%, 3/4 external detection. So that means a lot of times organizations are not finding these intrusions themselves. It's someone from the outside, someone external, that is identifying the intrusion and bringing those intrusions to them. Now, you're probably imagining which of these two is better. Right? Is it better to have an external or internal? I would say it's quite obvious. It's a lot better if you detect the intrusion internally than externally. If you compare, I don't think I have a slide for it here, but if you compare the dwell times, actually we can probably look at this slide. What you'll see is that the externally identified intrusions have much higher dwell times than the internally identified, which makes perfect sense, right? If you detect it internally, you're probably going to detect it fast. If you don't detect it internally, and it's only someone on the outside that later detects it for you, the amount of time that passes is very likely going to be greater as well. And so you see higher dwell times with the external than the internal detections.
Steve, a quick question here, weird one, but I'm going to ask nevertheless, which is, do you think bug bounty programs could be a good way to sort of bring in a cross-section of their external finds into internal, because we can learn from them, get better at it, and sort of add them to our internal bucket, at least going forward, and subsequent attacks are sort of prevented? Because I see abysmally low numbers of bug bounty programs, at least in APAC. What's your take, Steve?
Yeah, I think bug bounty programs are great. We have a bug bounty program at Google. It pays out a lot every year. It's good for the researchers who identify vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and it's good for the companies that are then notified and protected by a friendly white hat researcher who's exposing that vulnerability, rather than a black hat hacker who is extorting the victim out of a payment. So I think there's a lot of value in those programs. You have to think through carefully the terms and conditions, work with legal teams, but yeah, generally those can provide a lot of value. Okay, let's look at ransomware also. So we used to just track dwell time independently. And then the last 5 years or so, ransomware really ramped up. And ransomware kind of throws a monkey wrench into the dwell time. Because if you're not a ransomware threat actor, you're just an espionage threat actor trying to steal data, you want to stay hidden for as long as possible, indefinitely, if possible, so you can just keep stealing information. But that's not how ransomware threat actors work. Ransomware threat actors reveal themselves when they drop a ransom note extorting the victim. And so the behavior is very different. Um, if you separate out the ransomware dwell times versus the non-ransomware dwell times, you get a very different picture. The median ransomware dwell time in APAC is 18 days, which makes sense. Once the ransomware threat actor gets in, they don't want to stay hidden, they want a payday. And so as soon as they can encrypt servers, steal data, and drop a ransom note, they will do that. And that takes them about 2.5 weeks. If you then take the dwell time, which earlier we saw was 33 days, and you subtract out all of those ransomware attacks where the ransomware actor revealed themselves and said, well, how long does it take APAC organizations to identify intrusions that are espionage focused? It's closer to 2 months, right? So the dwell time almost doubles from 33 days to 6 months, or to 2 months rather. So it's interesting to look at the comparison there. Now, I want to come back to the drop in this curve, and we might ask, what's really helping? Uh, why is this drop here? Is it just that teams are getting better? Is it that there's new tools which are helping? And I would say the reason you're seeing this decline in dwell time over the last 6 years is because of a change in thinking in security. The old way, the way organizations were thinking in 2017 was we have to do prevention. We have to prevent every and any cyber attack possible. And uh, and there was also a thinking that prevention is better than a cure, meaning that if an attacker gets in, you might be able to buy some capabilities which can mitigate that intrusion, identify it and remove it. And those would be good, but not as good as preventing it in the first place. And so that's how a lot of organizations thought in 2017. And that's why the dwell times were so high, because when prevention failed, that was it. There was no other capability organizations were investing in to identify prevention failures. Everything was prevention. I would say now in 2023, we've shifted from a prevention mindset to much more of a resilience mindset. And the resilience mindset says, yes, prevention is good and prevention is important. But I think we realize through looking at the news and all the breaches that we've seen that there is no 100% effective prevention. There will always be someone in the organization who clicks on something they shouldn't click on, who types their password into the wrong website and gets their credentials phished. There will always be a way for an attacker, given enough time and enough motivation, to defeat prevention. And so while prevention is good and important, it's not enough. We need a capability as well to detect prevention failures, detect them quickly, and respond to successful intrusions. And I would say in security, we call that detection and response. And so you have a whole bunch of new technologies like EDR, endpoint detection and response, NDR, network detection and response, XDR, extended detection and response. You have services like MDR, managed detection and response. And all of these have emerged over the last 5 years. And those detection and response technologies, they don't help with prevention. They begin when prevention fails. They're a separate capability to notice prevention failures, notice them quickly, and to remediate them. And when you take prevention and you take detection and response and you put them together, what you have is cyber resilience, right? Yes, maybe over enough time I'll suffer an intrusion, but I'm resilient to that intrusion so that it doesn't impact my business. I notice it quickly and I deal with it before it becomes a significant business problem. And that mindset shift, along with the detection and response technologies and services, is why I think you see this drop in dwell time over the last 6 years. So there's great success, but depending on which number you look at, the 33 days or the 60 days, if you subtract out the ransomware, it's still too high. So there's still work to be done, still improvement, but we're headed in the right direction overall.
Steve, quick question on that point. Do you also attribute some of this to the cloud movement and people moving from the data center world to the cloud for a reason that's also been a question from a bunch of startups who have made that move, who have felt, sort of the threats go down thanks to the fact that some of these security SOPs come out of the box on the cloud?
Right. Yeah, I think the cloud is generally more secure than on-premise. There may be an intuition that, well, if it's on-premise, it's close to me, I can control it. And I would say that's kind of like hiding your money under your mattress, right? You know it's there and maybe it feels good, but rationally, it's a lot better to put that money in a bank because
Right.
the bank has the economies of scale. It can protect those assets much better than you can at home. And the same is true for data in the cloud. Right? The cloud vendors are protecting orders of magnitude more data than you would have in a local data center, and their investments in security are going to be significantly higher as well. So generally, you get better security out of the cloud than you could roll your own on-premise. That being said, security is a little bit different in the cloud. And you need to learn about and understand, what are the things that we need to do to make sure, we're being responsible with cloud security. And there's some requirements, right, and responsibilities for the cloud customers to maintain that cloud security. But if you do that, I would say that you can generally enjoy much higher level of security than you could on-premise. Okay. Let's look at, and again, this is all from, this data is all taken from Mandiant incident response investigations. Let's look at targeting. So this is global targeting. And you could see, industries across the board are all under attack. Now there's some industries that are under more attack than others. You've got government at the top of the list. And you can imagine the nation state threat actors are responsible for a large part of that. You've got business and professional, important vertical for India. You've got financial, high tech, and healthcare kind of at the top of the list. So this is where we see our clients, these are the industries, our clients who hire us for incident response are coming from, but that's not to say the other industries aren't being attacked. They are. It's just maybe slightly less than those primary industries. And then mission objectives, right? So a lot of the attacks are financial gain. About 26% of the attacks that we see are financially motivated. And the vast majority of those are ransomware-based attacks. So the preferred method of monetization for financial-based attacks is ransomware. I would say the one we see second to that is around cryptocurrency, attacks on cryptocurrency exchanges. The largest ransomware attacks can net attackers millions or tens of millions of dollars. The attacks against cryptocurrency exchanges sometimes go into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And then the other motivation is data theft. We see this about 40% of the time. And about 8% of that, the data theft is done for extortion, meaning the attacker steals your data. This could be any data you have, customer data, HR data, payroll data, and says, we're going to make this data public unless you pay us a certain amount by a certain time, right? And that's how data theft actors extort victims out of money as well. We see that quite a bit. And then there's how the attackers break in. So this is quite interesting. You know, an attack doesn't happen all at once. An attack, a cyber attack happens in stages. And one of the first stages is called initial compromise. And that's how the attacker breaks in as a first step. And a lot of times, a few years ago, the number one way that attackers were breaking in was phishing. Today, the phishing has dropped to the second most prevalent at 22%. Above that, we see exploitation of vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities are, you know, software bugs in programs that attackers can interact with in just the right way in order to give them illegitimate access. And of course, you close the door on these exploits and vulnerabilities when you patch systems. And this is why patching is so important. It's because it addresses the number one exploitation vector, or rather the number one infection vector that attackers use, which is exploitation of vulnerabilities. And then the other half of the time is a whole array of other initial compromise techniques. So there's not just one way that attackers are breaking in. There's two very common ways, followed by a whole array of other methods used to break in. And kind of interesting is that these differ by geography as well. If you step away from the global and you look at a specific geography, in EMEA, it still is the case that phishing is the most common initial infection vector for that region. Americas is exploit, and here in Asia Pacific, it's something called prior compromise. And so what is prior compromise? Right? Prior compromise, this idea is that there was a previous intrusion in the organization, and maybe that organization thought they remediated that intrusion, thought that they expelled the attacker from their network, but they didn't. They only did a partial remediation. And so because it wasn't cleaned up properly, the attacker was able to regain access from the previous access that they had. And you can imagine how this happens. In a security operations center, maybe a SOC analyst gets an alert. The alert points to a machine. The analyst says, okay, this machine has malware on it. Let's reimage the machine, install a fresh operating system to make sure that we eradicate any malware on the machine. But what that analyst didn't do is he didn't ask, what did the malware do? And did the malware give a remote intruder interactive access to the machine? And what did that remote intruder do with that interactive access? Did they capture any passwords? If they did capture passwords, just reimaging the machine doesn't remove the human attacker. The attacker still has the password and they can just log in. And so that would be an example of prior compromise. So it's really important to remediate these intrusions thoroughly. And you can only do that when you do an investigation. A lot of times, organizations will jump from a detection to response. In fact, the NIST framework, right, is identify, protect, detect, respond. But between detection and response, there needs to be investigation. If you just reimage the machine you had a detection on, you're remediating the malware, but you're not remediating the attacker, right? And so it's really important to do that investigation.
So Steve, a quick question there. An interesting point on the recent slide, along with the point that you mentioned with respect to bugs in your routines or code, which could potentially bring in an ingress. Brings us to this question. This is a question that's been asked by some of our founders as well. How much of this is a developer KPI versus how much of this could be a leadership KPI? Because some of these also require standard operating procedures and run books to be sort of deployed on the field, so that the engineer who was sort of reimaging understands, hey, you know what, I have to also do these three things as a part of my RCA before I can report back. And there's always been a gray area, been murky waters from day zero, still continues to be surprisingly, even in later stage companies. Steve, what's your take?
Yeah, so we like to say that security is everyone's responsibility, including leadership. If the leadership sets a culture where the only thing that matters is time to market, the only thing that matters is project deadlines, then you can't blame the developer for mapping to those goals. Security will fall by the wayside. So it is important for leadership to set a culture where security is taken seriously. And in fact, it's in leadership's best interest to do that, because if they don't, and there is a security breach, remember, security impacts the business, not IT. And so it's most likely those business leaders who will feel the impact. When we see high profile breaches in the news, who is the spokesperson? It's usually the CEO who has to come out and address the issue. Sometimes it even costs the CEO their job. And so it's important to make sure that leadership is setting a culture of cybersecurity where security is focused on throughout the development cycle and not thought of as an afterthought. Just build it and then we'll add the security later doesn't really work. Okay, one of the really interesting things we see is, well, if there's dwell time of 33 to 60 days, when Mandiant comes in and responds to an incident and the victim says, we believe we're under attack, and we come in and we do a forensic investigation, sometimes we find that, yes, there's an attacker in your network, but the bad news is there's not just one attacker. There's actually multiple different groups with different motivations in your network simultaneously. And how often does that happen? It's about 25% of the time. In 2022, it jumped up to 27. So the organization, saw something, and that revealed not just one, but actually multiple threat groups in their network. You might be getting the feeling, hey, how does anyone know if they have an attacker in their network or not? And that's a great question to ask. One of the things organizations can do is called a compromise assessment. It's like a health screen, an annual health screen done on the inside of the network. That's like a mini IR looking for compromise that may have gone undetected. Then there's techniques. So there's a framework called the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and it's a common language for all of the building blocks that attackers use to string an attack together. And we do an analysis of the MITRE ATT&CK framework against the investigations we do. We see that the top 10 techniques are listed here. And this is helpful for organizations who have red teams or who are doing security validation or breach and attack simulation. They can take these building blocks, which are the most common building blocks of attacks, and try and replicate them in their environment to see how vulnerable they are. It's a way to prioritize security testing, penetration testing, or red teaming. Aside from the numbers portion of the M-Trends report, we also tell some stories. And so one of the stories we tell is a red teaming engagement. A red team is when an organization hires a security firm like Mandiant to try and break into it. And not just break in, but try and achieve something from a cyber perspective which would impact the business. And so in a red team, the client organization gives the security vendor mission objectives. And so in this case, a client hired us and they said, Mandiant, we want to see if you can break into our network, if you can compromise our Microsoft domain controller to such a point that you have domain admin privileges, And then we want to see if you can extend that on-premise domain administrator rights and use that to compromise our cloud. And this client happened to be using Microsoft Azure, and they challenged us to see if we could get global administrator privileges in their Azure cloud environment. And then the third thing they wanted us to do was to do a supply chain attack. They said, we're a software house, we build software, we're concerned about supply chain attacks. Could you compromise our development pipeline such that you could Trojanize a production application, right? And so those were the three mission objectives. Those three things are much more serious things than just, can you break into my network, right? So the can you break into my network is a pen test. These mission objectives are a red team. And as I said before, a cyber attack doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages. And so these are the stages of the attack lifecycle. You could see initial compromise. We actually did initial compromise for this attack with in-person physical access. We pretended to be a maintenance person, gained access to their office location, and from there was able to establish a foothold, was able to map the internal network and understand their network architecture. We're able to escalate privileges to get administrator privileges, move laterally across the network. And in the end, we were able to achieve all three of those mission objectives: complete access of the local network, complete access of the cloud network, and Trojanize their development pipeline. So that's not to say we win and they lose. The point of this is like sparring. It's so that their defensive teams can get better. We, of course, after doing this exercise, reveal everything we did to accomplish this so that they can understand those gaps and close them. And a red team is great because it exposes the real world truth of how good your security program is across people, process, and technology. Is it all really working together or not? We also look at threat groups and malware, and I think we're coming up on time, so I'll just speed up a little bit. We track different types of groups, financial threat actors, APT threat actors. APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat. And when you hear that, that's code word for a nation state-backed hacker. Typically not someone who's interested in hacking for money, but someone who's interested in hacking for espionage and data collection. We track over 3,000 groups globally, and there's hundreds of new groups that appear every year. We also track malware. This is also good for informing penetration testing and red teaming. The most common malware we see globally is a tool called Beacon, which is part of the Cobalt Strike red teaming toolkit, but is actually used by attackers. And so this is an important piece of malware to understand and to make sure that you have strong defenses against, because it is very much a favorite tool of attackers to use. Soda no Kibi is a ransomware variant. That's number 2 in APAC. And Dragon Juice is a scanning tool we see in APAC. We also name new threat groups. So I mentioned the APT threat groups. It doesn't work in a way where our incident response teams do an investigation, see a new group, and suddenly name that APT group. It takes years to name an APT group. We have to encounter them many, many times. We have to understand them inside and out. Before they're an APT group, they're called a UNC, or an uncategorized group. The APT groups are groups that we know very, very well. And so last year, we promoted from UNC to APT a group called APT 42. This is an Iranian nexus threat group that conducts espionage using pretty sophisticated phishing and social engineering attacks. And the other group we promoted was a group called APT 43. This is a group that publicly is known as Kamsuki or Thallium. And this is a group that's focused on espionage, which is interesting because most of what you see in the press from North Korea cyber attacks is usually financially based attacks, particularly cryptocurrency based attacks. But this is a group focused on espionage. However, they do some cybercrime as well. And we suspect that that is to self-fund their own operation, right? So their mission objective is espionage, but they do some cybercrime on the side to fund their operations. The M-Trends report also shares some specific stories around APAC, talks
Question.
about a camp. Question?
Yeah. How do you identify these groups?
So the groups get identified by the incident response work we do. So as we do incident response, we collect all of the data and artifacts, malware, techniques, and we put those in the, I'll put on the previous page, the UNC groups, and we track these UNC. They're essentially information of clusters of activity. And as we help additional victims, sometimes these clusters are the same clusters. And so we can merge them. And over time, we may encounter a group like APT42 dozens of times. And so these clusters merge and get bigger and bigger, and our the picture becomes more full, and our understanding becomes more full of this group.
Basically, attack patterns, IP locations, and things like that. Correct?
Yeah, so the IP locations tend not to be so helpful because you can obviously proxy through lots of IPs, but we'll look at, for example, are they using any passwords to protect any of their infrastructure? And are their passwords matching across these attacks? Or even the order of command line arguments that they use, or the syntax that they use in attacks can all be clues that the clusters might be related. We won't look at any individual indicator. There has to be a set of indicators that give us a high degree of confidence that these two attacks, there's actually the same threat group behind them.
Right. And how many groups in total have we identified?
Yeah, so right now we're tracking over 3,500 groups. Most of those are going to be the UNC clusters of activities, but today we have 12 FIN groups and 43 APT groups that we track.
Got it. Thanks.
Sure. So in APAC, in the M-Trends, we've got some stories that are specific to our region as well. There was one of the stories was around USB malware that was seen targeting Philippines. The Felina zero-day vulnerability, which attacked Microsoft Diagnostic Protocol, we saw in India, as well as in Philippines, and North Korea espionage campaigns attacking South Korea and Japan. Some of those are some of the stories detailed in the M-Trends report. Like I said, the M-Trends report is freely available. You can just Google it, download it, and read it. There's lots of information. We just scratched the surface in this presentation today. Maybe as a takeaway, think carefully about incident response. One of the things that we see is that when victims call us, if they don't have an arrangement with us already, we have to put an arrangement in place in the form of a service contract. And service contracts take time because they involve lawyers, and terms and conditions have to be agreed on. And when your business is on fire and you're in crisis, you don't really have time for that. And so one of the good things to do is to make sure you have an incident response retainer in place. The retainer lets you establish the terms and conditions of the contract ahead of time before the crisis, and then lets you activate that contract if and when you have an incident. And so it's a great way to save time and a great way to have a safety net against unexpected cyber attacks. So you can get this episode and the previous episodes of the M-Trends report at mandiant.com/m-trends. And it's pretty interesting reading. And yeah, that's the presentation for today. I'm happy to answer any and all questions you've got on this content, or maybe even cybersecurity in general.
Hey Steve, there is one question in the chat. Let me just go over it. How often do you come across false positive attack alarms? So essentially, I think the question is around how much of the threat vectors could be false alarms, and I think some numbers, percentage around them, if you've seen them in your experience.
Yeah, certainly there's false alarms, or we call them false positives. Usually, usually the organizations have worked out internally whether a particular incident is a false positive or not before they call us. By the time they call us, usually it's a full-blown emergency, and there is generally not any question as to whether or not it is a real-world attack. So by the time we get it, most of what we see are true positives.
I think we just time. Shubham, over to you.
I see there's one more question that looks like it was sent directly to me in chat. It says, is there a possibility of attacking when the organization is making an investigation? Will the security be vulnerable when there is an ongoing investigation? Oh, absolutely. Right. So when the investigation is going, the attacker doesn't give up. Right. The attacker continues to fight. And as we're trying to extract the attacker out of the network, they're trying to hang on to their access in the network. And so one of the things, you often have to turn to quite drastic measures to eradicate an attacker from the network. One of the things to think about is enterprise-wide password resets. Right. So a good way to cut off the attacker's access is simply to reset every password. Every human password, every service account password, all change at once. And sometimes when we tell clients we need to do that, they come back and say, well, we've never done that before. We don't have a process for that. We don't know what would break if we changed every password. And so that's a good way to prepare as well. We call it a red lever event. Practice these red lever events. Have a procedure in place for an enterprise-wide password. You can Google, if you're interested in that, you can Google Mandiant enterprise-wide password reset, and you can find some webinars and white papers on us talking about that.
Cool, sounds good. Thanks a lot for that, Steve.
Sure.
I'm quickly jumping in because we're 2 minutes over time, and we should wrap up now. It's middle of the workday for most of us. But I really appreciate, Steve, all the knowledge that you were able to share. Just to wrap things up, it's always very, very helpful to be on top of security. And we've seen this, like you said, that mostly folks pay attention to this once they've experienced an attack. So everyone who's a part of this call today has obviously taken that initiative, assuming they have the no major attacks. But staying on top of security is something that you're already doing. So fantastic. And I guess, pat on back for everyone who's on this call today. That's just about it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, huge thank you to Steve for doing this, Santosh, to you too as well. And most importantly, all of you who took out the time to join us. I hope this was useful.